now we're going to have, I think, a little open time. Athena, is that right? Are we going to do some questions afterward? Answer some whole panel questions at this point?
Yes. So we have wrapped up the official schedule, and we have to acknowledge that the attendees had not as interactive experiences as panelists. So I think it would be good if we take some live questions from the audience for all of us, not just for the last session. So whoever wants to raise their hand and ask questions, now is a good time for that. And then we can conclude. If people from the attendees have questions, you can now raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can take your question. All right. I don't see many. Oh, okay, I see. All right. I saw some hands going up and down. All right. Anybody wants to ask a question to anyone that was on the panel today? If not, maybe...
Athena, I do have one question before I leave. Actually, I was about to leave, let me ask one question. Hi. So, very fascinating sort of discussion all through. One of the things that came up, I think, in all the different sessions was basically this whole aspect of effectiveness of the technology itself. So I'm actually wondering, I noticed that I think Paul pointed out that there are some papers, there's a science paper and there's a study that he's also working on and so on, that TC pointed to, which people have explored how effective this electronic, basically, contact tracing can be. But are these studies based on real products? Because or are they based on mathematical models? Because I'm just wondering, before we address, let's say, privacy and security, these aspects and so on, even if I allowed, let's say, these issues are not there, for instance, right? How effective is, given the limitations of sensing technology? I think one of the speakers pointed out, like, Bluetooth, for example, will not work very well. Actually, several people pointed it out and so on. Depends on, I think Ashkan said that, correct? Like with the thumb in your pocket or whatever, in back pocket versus keeping it in the front pocket, the signal sense is different. So do we have a real understanding as to how effective these technologies are? Modulo, forgetting about privacy, forgetting about security, forgetting about everything else. So we are sort of working towards solving a problem. If it's not that effective, then what's the point? So are there some real studies that have been done of this kind?
So just to jump in, I believe DP3T did some real world studies very early on in, like, I want to say May. I'll try to find that, but they essentially had a bunch of, I believe, military folks or volunteers wear beacons and then recorded their activities moving around to judge the effectiveness of Bluetooth as a proxy, separate from whether it's an effective proxy for exposure, just whether Bluetooth, how effective it is to judge whether two people are actually physically proximate to each other. Okay. So DP3T, I can find that somewhere.
Actually, if that points us to that will be very useful. Like, I just wanted to say one thing. So we did similar studies with the Navy as well, using our stuff as well. And also the report was 100% accurate and so on. But most of these studies where people are in a controlled environment are not necessarily replicatable in the real world. And I think that's a very, very big issue, because we are sort of trying to design a solution for the masses, which is completely uncontrolled environment. So I'm not too convinced with, let's say, the reports which come out, which are sort of, including our own study of this kind, which is 100% accuracy and 100% detection and so on. But it doesn't make much sense unless it's a controlled environment. So I just wonder if people have done this work.
Yeah, you can look up the NIST challenge on Too Close for Too Long. And the conclusion from that, in fact, our team from MIT and PathCheck was the winner of the challenge. And the conclusion was it's no better than chance. So there's almost no correlation between Bluetooth signal strength and distance in the real world. On the other hand, so that's why I think if you treat Bluetooth as some kind of a exchange, as some kind of a scientific instrument, that's just a wrong mindset. Yeah, it's almost like a binary. Like if you say, is there somebody within 5 meters? Then yes, you can get into a pretty good point on the ROC curve. But if you try to play, really smart and say, hey, I want something within 2 meters, but outside 2 meters, I want the other way, there is no chance. You're just going to have 50% false negatives and 50% false negatives.
Great.
All right. So do we have more questions to anyone from the panelists that are still around?
I think I had a question. I know I was not on this panel. I was on an earlier panel, and I was talking more about algorithmic aspects. But given the star power on this panel, I was just wondering, what's your take on other aspects of contact tracing? Not necessarily, the proximity protocols, but if you think about case management and so on. I mean, in New York, about 200,000 people were infected, which means about 2 million people were in the contact tracing data sets. And these are people's names, addresses, who your roommate is, how many times you met the infected person, what your sexual orientation is, are you Hispanic or not, what job you have, how many people live in your house. All this information about 2 million New Yorkers is sitting in on some platform. And that's even worse than some other data sets that are out there, because this is a social graph, not just information about individuals.
Well, this is what I was getting at earlier when I talked about when you consider new forms of exposure notification and tracing, you have to consider the bad risks of them, but also the risks of the old system. And you don't necessarily want, of course I'm exaggerating, but 2 million 3x5 cards sitting in an office somewhere in Albany with people's sexual orientation on it. I don't know, it's probably knowable. I don't happen to know whether the governor of New York has put any limits or any timetable or anything on what's supposed to happen to that data. I don't know, has anybody ever, anyone on here looked at any of the actual state contact tracing policies and can tell us if there's limits on those sorts of things?
I mean, I'm curious to hear from others, but the problem with the public health system or digital health is that the digital health has a very low barrier for privacy. There's confidentiality, there's anonymity, and there's privacy. And you almost always stop at confidentiality. It says, hey, you know what? It's okay under HIPAA and under those things if thousands and thousands of people know who you are and what your things are going, but it's just those thousands of people.
And I think that you also see the limits or what the effects of having years and years of degraded public health systems where, public health offices are, kind of using rickety Excel files holding probably a lot of sensitive information in them. And so I think that when you layer on all of these things, it is of concern. And I think, I guess I can be provocative because, we're at the end of a conference and so, well, is this the right infectious disease to do contact tracing on? I mean, normally if you think about how contact tracing has been used the most, it's been for sexually transmitted disease or diseases that are less transmissible. So the scale is smaller. Is that, when you have something as transmissible as this on the scale of this, is contact tracing a tool from the pandemic or infectious disease toolbox that we should be using because of does the benefit outweigh the risk?
Yes. And, I think we have been held hostage by well-meaning epidemiologists, Julie, such a good point, because all the decisions are being made by epidemiologists who are amazing. But like you said, maybe it's the wrong problem they're solving.
I do think, I've been critical of the various approaches and where the lines have been drawn. I think my biggest issue is the kind of lack of leadership on what the right kind of property for these, what the right properties are and where the lines should be drawn. It strikes me as like coming from an engineering background. It's like you always think of your disaster recovery plan after the disasters happen, and you quickly try to plan for it in the middle of it, and then you forget all about it. Others have made this point. I think that's where we are now. And even if in the world where it's not digitally mediated tools, right, we have these issues around just kind of trust and authority and leadership, right? A lot of the vectors we've seen for abuse are outside of the digital space, people using, in the UK, calling scams
I think one of the many negative things that's coming out of the last year 9 months, whatever, is, and we used to have this problem in the intelligence business all the time. Intelligence officers would go brief a president or a secretary of state or a national security advisor and give them the intelligence, but the intelligence is almost never 100%. And a lot of it is much more art than science, as we found out twice in Iraq, when in 2 different wars, we got it wrong about whether or not they had WMD. And what that always leads to is people saying, oh, you shouldn't have believed the bureaucrats, or you shouldn't have politicized the process by making a different decision. The truth is, and I think it's the same with epidemiologists, that elected officials have a responsibility that goes beyond just blindly following what an intelligence officer says, or just blindly following what an epidemiologist says, no matter how qualified they are. Now, I have to say, in our country, I think we've taken that principle a little too far this time, but people we need to do a better job of educating voters that not every decision the government makes can be decided by an expert.
Yeah.
And by the way, an expert who doesn't have to face the voters.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the whole idea behind, I mean, I'm just like really showing all of my like policy, you know, like bureaucratic wonk kind of feathers right now. I'm just leaning in. But, you know, I think that's the whole idea behind doing planning and response, not just like, yes, a pandemic is a health event, but it's a health event that affects every single sector. Therefore, multiple sectors should be involved in making decisions, so when you talk about these interventions on a population scale, they really should, and I'm saying this as a health person, they shouldn't be made solely by health. And I think that you see the effects of this when that happens.
Yeah, so well said, so well said.
All right, I think it's getting late and it's time to wrap up a very interesting day, if you're okay with that.
No, not at all.
There are all people on the East Coast.
No, not at all. We're not ready.
There are still people in Europe that I can see that are here, so they're the heroes. All right.
I see when guys are logged back in, so that's good.
All right. So that concludes today's workshop. Thanks everyone for your participation. Maybe we can quickly summarize the 3 sessions. So we had a session on contact tracing systems. That was covered the Google Apple API, experience with the Spanish app, the Path Check initiative, some aspects of this at least, and the Tippers project. And we didn't have too much time for discussion. Discussion we had focused around inclusivity, scope of the app. There were many more discussions in the Q&A that they were basically of the flavor. What other functionality would we add? Would we share the contact graph and so on? So basically, are we solving the right problem with exposure notification? And what other technologies or modalities we should tap in to do a better job? And there was also online some discussion about security attacks that we didn't have time to cover. Jean, you want to summarize your session? Or any take-home message or anything that
Yeah, thank you. And I certainly enjoyed all sessions. Somewhat myopically, I enjoyed mine the most because it was lively and crowded with 6 sort of sets of people, teams. Some of them were teams presenting, but I definitely learned a lot from all of them. But I think my panelists in my session, they represented a pretty diverse set of folks. I mean, industry, in academia and research, government research labs. They were also some geographically diverse. I mean, I certainly wish we had somebody from Asia and Africa, but yeah, maybe next time. There's certainly one big outcome of this is that approaches vary and philosophies vary, and there's clearly a huge tension that I guess one could have guessed ahead of this panel, but the talks definitely and the Q&A underscored it, the tension between privacy, efficacy, and security. And I see no great progress inside as far as relieving that tension, but our awareness of it is a good thing. And I would like to say, yeah, it would be nice to have 100 flowers bloom, but in the end, I don't think having 100 apps bloom would be a good global solution to this pandemic or contact tracing in general. Thank you.
Woody, any thoughts for your session?
Sure. I mean, I learned a lot. I think that the presentations we saw did a really good job of laying out both the substantive challenges about privacy and policy in the pandemic, ranging from the power yielded by the private sector to make, sort of quasi-regulatory decisions that have great inertia, and also the sort of the difficulties in getting the necessary trust to make these things work, and the efficacy questions, and then also procedural questions about what comes first, and should we answer the efficacy question before we even start deploying this as a way of protecting privacy interests and civil rights interests. And then I really appreciated actually mapping ways forward. I mean, our keynote talked about ways in which we can disease surveillance can be done in a more effective way. And then in our Q&A, we found ways out. I don't know if we have the political capital to execute them, but the solutions are there. And so I left on an optimistic note, actually, even given all the threats and all the problems, that there's a path out if we can muster the will to do it.
All right. So we will clean up the video and post it on the website. I may also ask the panelists for the slides if they're comfortable sharing, so people can use these materials later. People can connect directly with whoever makes sense. And I believe that this is not the last event on this topic. I know several of you have already scheduled things or ongoing initiatives on similar topics. Anybody wants to say what is the next thing coming? I know Ramesh has something coming up soon, or am I wrong? Or
you said additional events? Yeah, pandemic.mit.edu.
Right. So, and I put the links of initiatives I know of at the bottom of the website. If there are more related initiatives that you would like us to link from the workshop website, we're happy to just send it to us. And Alex, do you have any last words you want to share?
No, I'm just really thankful for everybody for a very successful workshop. And I think it's, we'll need time to digest it, but I think thank you. And Tina, thank you so much. You put so much effort into this. So hopefully we'll have a weekend to recover. And
right. Have a nice weekend, everyone. Nice to see you all. And keep in touch and stay safe. Bye-bye.